Look at this humble potato. It can be boiled, mashed, stuck in a stew, fried, baked, and even be fermented. It's hardy, it's easy to grow, and it provides enough nutrients and calories for a healthy life. Ireland has had an unlucky track record relying on the humble potato. However, and the British for basic rights, but most infamously during the 7-year Great Famine of 1845 and 1852. But this wasn't the only time the Irish starved in great numbers. A quick weather report from 1739, a century before the Great Famine. In September, as you can see, there were lots of rain clouds coming into Ireland, followed by dry conditions in October that were much colder than normal. Then, the Great Frost hit, the coldest winter of the century in Europe. Temperatures plummeted over the following months, and many found themselves short on fuel to keep warm, many succumbing to hypothermia. Even the longest river in Ireland, the Shannon, froze, something it has not done since. The thaw came that February, but this revealed a much deeper problem. The freezing conditions had left the nation's potato crop ruined. There were no public emergency grain houses, and the few potatoes left in storage underground were made inedible. To make matters worse, the seed potatoes, the ones that would be used to plant new crops, were also ruined. So replacing the lost crop would be difficult, to say the least. On top of all this, the changing weather patterns made the winter and spring unusually dry, with eyewitness George Faulkner stating that from Christmas until April, there was no rain at all. And yet there was no famine in England nor Scotland, conveying just how low of a priority Ireland was for the empire. Potatoes weren't the only crop to fail. Others, like wheat, were also ruined, with replacement crops difficult to grow in the cold, dry climate. The price of wheat tripled, with other foodstuffs going up at a comparable rate. Animals suffered too. The drought also destroyed fodder for sheep, cows, and other livestock, and according to Faulkner's account, over 40,000 sheep died over a 2-month span in the province of Connacht in Western Ireland. As you can imagine, the poor were hit the hardest. With most of their food stores ruined, they became desperate. First, and most obviously, they ate less, and the daily caloric intake plummeted. What they did manage to scrounge to eat was less than appetizing. Potatoes that would otherwise be inedible were eaten anyway. Added to this would be the spoiled and sour milk, stinging nettles, and whatever else was available, regardless of the taste, quality, or safety. With such a limited and low-quality diet, it's no wonder that disease outbreaks became common and dysentery outbreaks ravaged the country. In some places, the dead were being buried on a daily basis with no end in sight. This was in spite of foods like butter, beef, barley, malt, and hake still being sent abroad, including to feed British soldiers in Spain during the War of Jenkins' Ear, when they could have been handed out at home. The desperate also resorted to crime. Riots broke out and many were killed or injured, and food would be taken in the confusion. Food theft became more and more common, and the jails began to overflow from the numbers of people just trying to keep their bellies full. Many were shipped off to the New World as punishment to ease the numbers sitting in Irish prisons. At this time, there wasn't much in the way of organized government relief. Aid came in the form of individual efforts from local clergy and church officials and the landed aristocracy. In Waterford, the local gentry established a food distribution system that kept 1,800 people fed per day. Other cities, towns, and villages like Cashel did the same, collecting donations, buying food, and distributing it to the needy. Some wealthy people started public works projects as a way to keep unemployment down. As much as they may have tried to relieve the suffering, these efforts were sporadic and not coordinated enough to provide relief for the starving and disease-racked population. Some food was shipped in from outside the country, but this was mostly distributed to coastal towns and cities, and very little of this outside relief made it inland. The climate in 1740 continued to be dry, and what crops could be planted failed because of the lack of rain. That winter, the weather was again unusually cold, killing off whatever crops the Irish farmers managed to plant. Conditions of 1741 only worsened as more and more of the population died to the famine or disease. With the situation becoming more and more desperate with each passing day, the food riots became more severe. The worst happened on April 25, 1741, when starving Irish peasants attacked a boat carrying a shipment of oats to Waterford City. They managed to take 60 barrels of oats from the boat, but 5 were killed and 11 were wounded in the attempt. Then, in mid-year, things started to turn around. In June, 5 ships docked in Galway, Western Ireland, loaded with grain, and a month later, the price of grain dropped to pre-famine levels. That September, Ireland was hit by a series of severe storms that caused flooding. But then the weather returned to normal. The following winter was mild, and the weather was fair enough for planting, and the famine ended. The famine was called Bliain, or Year of the Slaughter by the Irish. When it was all over, it was estimated that around 400,000 Irish starved or succumbed to disease, though the lack of records makes this figure hard to confirm. If true, though, it would mean that around 15% of Ireland's population died during the 2-year famine, a much greater proportion of the population than in the mid-1800s Great Famine. Unlike the Great Famine, this didn't have as deep an impact on Irish society for many possible reasons. Though some did immigrate or were deported for crimes, there was no mass migration to further deplete the population because most couldn't afford it. The Irish economy was able to bounce back fairly quickly with the more stable weather, and the Bliain was eventually overshadowed. The famines of the 1740s and 1840s caused mass death on an unprecedented scale in Irish history. That wasn't the end of famines, though. In 1879, only a couple of decades after the Great Famine, Ireland was once again plagued by significant crop failures. Poor weather conditions and the blight that devastated crops a generation earlier came back, destroying harvests of potatoes that large portions of the country still relied on. Fortunately, this famine was relatively minor compared to the earlier shortages. The blight primarily affected the western portion of the country, and expanded rail networks allowed relief supplies and surplus food to be moved quickly to the affected areas. On top of this, Ireland had much more help from both the British government and from abroad. The large Irish population in the United States immediately sprang into action, not wanting a repeat of the suffering a few decades before. Newspapers gave extensive coverage to the unfolding events, and the New York Herald helped to coordinate relief efforts. They managed to gather $200,000 in donations, and in March of 1880, the USS Constellation was sent by the Naval Department with 3,300 barrels of food, as well as clothing. The crisis was quickly averted, with few deaths and migrations. Its impact was much larger, however. At this time, up to 97% of Irish farmland was owned by large landowners who rented out the land to tenant farmers. When the famine hit, many of these tenants were unable to pay the rent, and though many landlords didn't collect rents during the crisis, many still demanded money from farmers who had no money to spare. Angered by unfair land ownership practices, Irish farmers organized into the Land League, led by Irish nationalists Michael Davitt and Charles Stewart Parnell. They started a series of organized agitations until the passage of legislation to reduce rents and other reforms, and was a key moment in the Irish independence movement. On a side note, one land agent, Charles Cunningham Boycott, refused to lower or end demands for rent payments during the famine and evicted many farmers when they didn't have the money to spare. Fed up with his cruel treatment, the workers on lands he managed refused to work until they were given better terms, and the word boycott entered the English language. And all of this over the humble potato.